All right, here we go this morning. We're going to be looking at engine diagnosis, symptoms, and problem cause. We're going to be talking about engine parts and troubles that they have, how we can diagnose, how we can know what the symptoms are, and what leads us to the actual cause. Okay, so here we go. So, first, symptoms. So, let's see if we can get that thing to focus for us correctly. Sorry, it's not really focusing just yet. Okay, there we go. Hopefully, it will. There we go. So first symptom is the car lacks power. And I'm going to work on getting this to focus while we just... Car lacks power. And there's a lot of things that can cause us to lack power. The first thing we're thinking about is cylinder compression and so on. So cylinder compression, and these days we lean on our check engine light really hard to know if we have a misfire. Think of a clogged exhaust. Think of a catalytic converter that's grenaded inside, that's clogging the exhaust. That's a real modern day issue. So those are typically what we're looking at these days. We used to look at, carburetor issues. We would look at ignition timing. Because that's all adjusted by the computer now, we don't look at that anymore. We do need to think about fuel system cleaning, making sure our injectors are clean and our fuel filters clean. So air filters, fuel filters, misfires, clogged exhaust, those are our common kinds of things for lacking power. Secondly, poor gas mileage. So when we think about poor gas mileage these days, instead of thinking just about ignition timing and so on, but these days we're looking at the oxygen sensors and seeing, or air fuel sensors, and seeing, are they doing their job properly? Do we have vacuum leaks that are messing with the readings of the computer? Always, we got to think on poor gas mileage. We got to think about our air filters being clean. We need to think about the mass airflow sensor. It's measuring incoming air being clean. But we've also really got to think about, how is the oxygen sensor cross-counting? Is it really, are we in what we call fuel control, where our short-term and long-term fuel trims are very close to zero, especially our short-term cross-counting above and below 0% of enrichment, and our O2 sensors are cross-counting above and below 0.5 volts continuously. We'll talk more about those. The other thing is, another symptom of is overheating. Is the engine overheating? And by the way, if I go back to gas mileage for just a second, how do I know I've got poor gas mileage? Have I reset the trip odometer, filled up my gas tank, driven a certain amount of miles, refilled up, looked at the miles I went on my trip odometer, looked at the fuel I put in? Am I really getting poor gas mileage? Sometimes I get a poor gas mileage complaint, and that's just people wanting their money to go further. So we need to know that we actually do have a poor gas mileage complaint. Next is overheating. If the vehicle's overheating, that could be a symptom, obviously, of a problem. Lots of problems. Could be a cooling system problem with a leak and it's causing overheating. Could be an internal engine problem like a blown head gasket. But are we overheating? And then can we confirm what our temperature gauge readings say? And then confirm that our fans are working and confirm that we're full of coolant and all these kinds of things. But overheating is going to be obviously a cause of engine problem. Next are noises. Do we have any engine noises? We know what injectors are supposed to sound like. We know what accessory drive pulley noise is supposed to sound like. If we've got a really new car with direct injection, the injectors are really loud. They're like ding, 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 really metallic. Do we know what noises, do we know what exhaust leaks sound like? So when we hear noises, can we identify a rod knock? Can we identify a piston slap? Can we identify, again, exhaust leaks, etc.? So what kind of noises do we have? Let's keep going here. Fluid leaks. What about fluid leaks? What about, obviously, coolant? But what about engine oil leaks? What about power steering leaks? And just being able to identify our fluid leaks to know that is a symptom of a problem. The classic is Subaru head gaskets leaking coolant from right where the head and the block meet, right in the center. So notorious for that, and then they have to have the head gaskets repaired. So we'll look at our fluid leaks to try and identify what's going on with the engine. How about smoking out the tailpipe? Blue smoke means we're burning oil. Black smoke means we've got too much fuel in the engine. And white smoke, number 3, is we've got coolant or water being burned. We've got to be able to look at what's coming out the tailpipe and make some significant evaluations about what's going on inside the engine, as well looking at um, uh, just erratic exhaust, misfire, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry about that camera. I don't know why it's going so crazy here. Let's talk about compression loss. So what are our sources of compression loss? Well, we got compression rings, as you can see right here, where it's broken out the piston ring and the piston ringland, and obviously you're going to have a compression loss there. So compression rings are really important when we think about compression loss. Head gaskets. If we have a head gasket leak like this one, we're going to have a compression loss, and you can see the firing ring on here is all messed up. So we're going to have that head gasket's not going to be sealing between the head and the block, and that's going to be a significant source of compression loss. Valve sealing. If our valves are not sitting down on the valve seat, they're going to burn, and you can see this one is burned here. That's just from heat because the valve was not touching the seat correctly. Maybe the valve guide was worn and the valve was not touching the seat. We've got a 03 Toyota Tundra out there, and it keeps getting a misfire in cylinder 3, and compression looks good, and ignition and fuel injection all look good, but it's got a misfire that keeps coming back, and it seems to be mostly at idle, although I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm still driving the vehicle. It's possible we got tight valves, and the valve adjustment needs to be done. And you say, well, why would it have a decent compression? Well, compression tests can't really pick up a tight valve so well. Usually I've seen it where it does not pick it up. And a leakage test might be able to pick it up a little bit better. But a dynamic compression test, meaning with the engine running and putting a compression gauge in that cylinder, making sure we disable the ignition and the fuel injection on that cylinder, might show it up. And that's something that we'll be looking on that 03 Tundra with the 3.4 liter V6. Cylinder 3, middle cylinder on the passenger side. It's not overheating, there's no coolant loss. Compression is around 170 psi, which is what it's supposed to be. But I'm beginning to wonder if we have a tight valves on that cylinder. Cylinder head crack like this one here can be a source of compression loss. Mostly it's usually a coolant loss into the cylinder, and then we start seeing white smoke out the tailpipe, but it could be a source of compression loss, the cylinder head crack. Broken piston or ring land, and that's really the same thing you've got up here on these rings here that we were talking about when we mentioned the compression rings a moment ago. So let's talk about sources of engine noise. Well, first is going to be detonation. So detonation, or what we used to call ping, or people do call ping, is when we get a secondary explosion above the piston. So this 5-liter Mustang or 5-liter Ford Exploder piston, what was happening was they're running too low octane of fuel, and they were towing a horse trailer up the grade, and what would happen was the piston would come up and you get a spark, and then you would get an explosion, and then you would get a secondary explosion, causes a sonic shock, the two collide, and it beats the top of the piston like that. So in any case, you got to think about running the right octane of fuel. You got to think about not overloading the vehicle. It's a 5-liter V8 and pulling a couple of horses and horse trams. Too much weight for that vehicle. You're asking the engine to do too much, and you're looking for a problematic situation. Yes, we have what's called a NOx sensor, which is a piezoelectric crystal that vibrates when it gets vibrated by detonation, which is by our spark knock or our pinging. In old cars, we could hear the pinging. On part throttle acceleration up a hill, we would hear this, rattling, and we would know we were detonating. Modern cars, we don't hear it so much, partially because of how they're insulated, but also because we have a NOx sensor backing the timing down. But in any case, detonation is definitely a source of noise. Rod bearing knock. You see rod bearings like this, you're going to have a rod bearing knock. Or if you have a rod bearing that looks something like this, where it completely lost oil, it's going to be knock, 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 knock. So you're really going to be hearing it. Doesn't sound like a diesel sound, sounds lower in the engine, but it's a rattling, especially as RPM goes up, especially as the engine gets warm and the oil thins out, you're going to hear it. Main bearings can make noise. It's not as pronounced as rod bearings. It's going to sound deeper, not as rattly, more deeper noise in the engine. Lifter noise, really common cause of engine noise is lifters. And cars that sit around for, if you leave them for months at a time and you go to start them, These are going to go clack, 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 clack for, sometimes I've seen them clack for 20 minutes before oil pumps them all up, bleeds all the air out, and they quiet down. If oil pressure is low, of course, we're going to hear the lifters clacking as well. And back to our rod bearings clacking, or sorry, knocking. Anytime you lose oil pressure or reduced oil pressure, or you don't clean your oil, it's going to wear the bearings. And when the bearings wear, they're going to have increased clearance, and then you're going to start hearing the rod journals basically banging around against the rod bearings and the connecting rods, etc. Really, it's the connecting rods slapping on the piston, on the crankshaft itself. Piston slap is where you have your skirts of the piston here and here. It's going up and down, and they're actually rattling back and forth, and you hear a slapping noise. It sounds kind of like a diesel engine noise. Ford modular engines, 5.4s, etc., are really notorious for it. After they get some age on them and people haven't warmed them up and haven't properly over the years and haven't changed the oil, I hear that engine, that 5.4 liter, with a lot of piston slap. It's pretty common. Okay, fuel pumps, old mechanical fuel pumps on Chevy 5.7 liters, 350 cubic inch. The fuel pump has a rod in there, and there's a spring on behind that arm of that fuel pump, and those go weak, and boy, it sounds just like a rod knock, and you're sure happy when you diagnose as a bad fuel pump. It's certainly a lot cheaper to fix that. Wrist pins can make what we call a double knocking sound. Piston goes up, and you hear kind of a double knocking sound as a wrist pin. That's out there. Sources of engine oil burning is next. Okay, so how do engines burn oil? Well, the first place where they burn engine, where the engine burns oil, is in the valve guides. So our valve guides here in this picture, they're tubes that locate the stem of the valve to make sure the face sits down in the seat, seals compression, and cools the engine. So if those valve guides are worn, or their stem seals like this small block Chevy O-ring type seal, if those seals are worn and they're not controlling oil is going to go down the guide onto the back of the valves, and oil is going to burn. So stem wear is going to cause the same thing as stem wear is going to cause the same thing as a worn valve guide. It's going to let oil down inside the cylinder, and the cause is going to be you're going to burn oil. Valve stem seals, if they're not sealing properly, they're going to let oil go down. This one has an umbrella seal here as well as an O-ring here. It's going to let oil go down inside there, and in either case, we're going to burn oil. Hey, if we got a positive crankcase ventilation valve, a PCV valve, and it's stuck open, it'll suck oil, especially during high vacuum conditions, from under the valve cover. So that's something we got to think about for burning oil. We'll pause here for a moment. So we're going to look at next, oil rings are a source of burning. So your piston oil rings can cause you to burn oil, because if this doesn't scrape the oil off the cylinder wall as the piston goes down, oil is going to go past that ring up into the combustion chamber and burn. You're going to see blue smoke out the tailpipe. So I'd like to make a connection between blue smoke out the tailpipe caused by valve guide wear or valve stem wear and piston rings. Usually you'll see valve guide or valve stem wear cause oil burning out the tailpipe on a hot shutdown and then restart. In other words, you've been driving the car, you shut it down, and then you start it back up, 20, 30 minutes later. So the engine's hot, and you'll see blue smoke out the tailpipe. That's usually valve guide or valve stem wear. Piston rings, when you accelerate hard, that's when you're going to see blue smoke out the tailpipe caused by a bad oil control ring on the piston, like up in here, where it's not scraping the oil off the wall and it goes up in the combustion chamber and burns. All right, so I think that's the last source of oil burning. So sources of oil leaks, we got lots of them. Valve cover gaskets will leak. Oil pan gaskets will leak. I don't have a valve cover gasket pictured here, but here's a steel valve cover gasket here, and you can get the cork or rubber seal here will leak. These will get bent and they'll no longer seal. Lots of engines have troubles with valve cover gasket leaks. Subarus do. The 3.4 liter Toyota V6s, they all have problems with the back valve cover gasket seal leaking. Oil pan gaskets. So you can see this oil pan here. Very common to have oil pan leaks. The gaskets just get crushed and compressed over years and years of vibration, and finally the bolts loosen up and they start leaking, etc. Another source of oil leak is timing cover gaskets. So a timing cover gasket be on the front of the engine, like this one here. If these O-rings, there's an O-ring seal that goes in this groove here, and if that O-ring seal leaks on any of those, it'll start leaking. I really like those aluminum engine covers and the those kinds of O-rings type seals, because they do a lot better job. Next is timing cover seal. So the timing cover gasket and the seal around the front of the crankshaft will leak. Those are fairly common. Intake manifold gasket leaks. Think Chevy 5.7 and 5.3s. Water crossover goes across the intake manifold, the front and rear. They're notorious for breaking the gaskets out right there, and then it starts leaking coolant into the valley. And then what happens when you get coolant in the valley, it'll suck water up in the oil, and then you'll spin a rod bearing. It happens a lot on these engines where this gasket goes bad, and it pumps oil into the valley, pumps water into the valley, dilutes the oil, and the bearings go bad. Cylinder head gaskets can leak oil externally. Think Subarus. They can leak oil internally, but into the coolant, but usually it's external when it does leak oil. The rear main seal. So on the back of the crankshaft, we've got our full annular rear main seal that can leak past the crank and out and come out between the transmission and the crankshaft. Oil pressure senders are notorious for leaking. When the little plastic sender body cracks, that sending unit will leak, and it will go usually all over the place because it's under pressure. Oil pan drain plug, you guys know that those leak if they don't get tight enough with the gasket's not good. And then finally, sources of oil pressure loss. So what you've got is, you've got lots of places in an engine where we can suffer oil pressure loss. Rod bearings and main bearings. If any of these bearings that I'm showing here look like, let me show you a worn rear main bearing. I think I've got one here. Looking for, well, you can see on this bearing, you can see the shadow of the wear there. That wear on that bearing is going to let oil leak out, and that'll be a source of oil pressure loss. And we're not talking about leaking externally. We're talking about an internal oil pressure leak. So any rod or main bearing can cause that. Cam bearings can do the same. So if you get a cam bearing like this, a full round cam bearing here, and it's worn out, it can start leaking oil pressure, lose oil pressure internally. Oil filters, you guys know if oil filter's not tight, that's going to be an oil pressure loss. Lifters. So if these lifters are worn, either on the outside of their body or internally, you're going to have an oil pressure leak. Usually it's on the outside register surface. These will dump oil back to the oil pan, and you'll have low oil pressure. And so I've got a picture, exploded view of a roller hydraulic lifter. Also got a picture of an oil pump that was cracked in several places, damaged, and that would obviously not be creating oil pressure. Oil pump itself, like you can see, either a crack or wear in the pump. An oil sender. Oil sending unit is not only a source of leak, but it's a source of pressure loss if it can leak oil pressure straight outside. Oil galley plugs. In the end of the block, where they drill oil tubes down through the block, they seal them at the end with plugs. So you can see on this cylinder head here, it's got some oil galley plugs right here. These two quarter pipe plugs are sealing oil galleys going down through. This one may be sealing coolant, but it might be sealing oil. I think this is coolant. I think these two are oil. On this block here, when you look over on this, there's an oil pressure sending unit that can leak oil and oil pressure. Looks like we've got a plug here and a plug here, and you can see the tubes coming down here and here towards the filter. And those plugs there, if they are loose, they'll cause an oil pressure loss on the engine as well. So, okay, so let's see what's next. Well, that's it. So that's our engine symptoms, problem cause, everything from engine noises, loss of power, leaks, etc. Should give you an overview of the kinds of things that we can identify as problems and then some of the causes of them. There you go.